the 14th of November 2004. For 2 weeks, military radars had been detecting something seemingly impossible, a series of objects falling from space only to stop dead in their tracks over the Pacific Ocean. That day, Commander David Fravor went to intercept them and came face to face with a white craft, lacking wings or engines, that defied every law of physics. The experienced pilot descended to investigate, and what happened next continues to defy human logic to this day. This is just one of many incredible and chilling stories that exist in the Great Blue Desert. Today, we are going to tell you some of them. So, get comfortable and turn off the lights, because these are 7 terrifying cases that occurred at sea. How are you doing? Good morning, afternoon, or evening? Let's begin. The Bluebell case. Dr. Arthur Dupereau was a successful optometrist from Wisconsin who had a long-held dream to take his entire family on an unforgettable adventure at sea. In November 1961, that wish came true when he, his wife Jean, and their 3 children Brian, 14, Terry Jo, 11, and little Renee, 7, traveled to Florida. There, they rented the Bluebell, an elegant one, 8-meter sailboat, with the idea of navigating the Bahamas to escape the winter cold. To captain the ship, they hired Julian Harvey, a decorated war veteran and expert navigator, who brought along his 6th wife, Mary Dean, to work as a cook during the journey. The trip began on November 8th with total normalcy. Arthur was so enthusiastic that he described the experience to friends and family as the vacation of a lifetime, promising they would be home before Christmas. But on the night of November 12th, while the sailboat was returning to Florida, something happened. The next day, an oil tanker called the Gulf Lion spotted a man screaming adrift in a small life raft. He was desperately calling for help. It was Captain Julian Harvey. With him was the lifeless body of 7-year-old Renee. Harvey claimed he had recovered the child's corpse from the water after a terrible accident. The captain told authorities a heartbreaking story. A sudden, violent storm had snapped the Bluebell's masts, breaking the hull and causing a fire that consumed the vessel in minutes. He claimed he tried to save everyone, but could only recover Renee's body in a failed attempt to resuscitate her. Harvey was taken to be treated for a health evaluation and then interrogated. 4 days later, on November 17th, news took an unexpected turn. The Greek freighter Captain Theo, while crossing the Providence Channel, encountered something, or rather, someone. It was the 2nd officer, Nicholas Spachidakis, who spotted something strange in the water, a white dot that didn't appear to be a fishing boat. As they approached, the sailors were horrified to discover a young girl with blonde hair, wearing a white blouse and pink corduroy pants. She was waving weakly from a cork float barely half a meter wide. The freighter's captain ordered the engines stopped as the crew watched in horror while several sharks circled the small raft. With great care, the rescuers pulled her aboard, finding her in a semi-comatose state, her skin sunburned and her lips cracked from dehydration. It was Terry Jo. She could only whisper her name before losing consciousness. The news of the miraculous rescue reached the U.S. Coast Guard. When Captain Julian Harvey was interrogated again, an officer informed him that Terry Jo was alive and recovering in a Miami hospital. At that moment, Harvey's face transformed. Although he tried to maintain composure and exclaimed that it was great news, his nerves betrayed him, and he asked to go rest. But instead of going to see his alleged family, as he had claimed he would, Harvey fled to a cheap motel under the false name of John Monroe. There, he wrote a brief suicide note and took his own life in the bathroom. When police found his body, the truth of what had happened on that boat began to emerge. Upon being interrogated after her recovery, young Terry Jo told the true story. That night, she had retired to her cabin early, leaving the other passengers on deck. Suddenly, she was awakened by gut-wrenching screams. It was her brother Brian calling desperately for his father. The girl went to the main cabin and found a terrifying scene. Her mother and brother lay on the floor in a pool of blood. Shortly after, she also saw the lifeless body of Mary Dean, the captain's wife. At that instant, Julian Harvey appeared, wielding a bloody knife, and with violent force, ordered the girl back down to the cabins. Terrified and unable to understand what was happening, Terry Jo took refuge in her bed while the ship began to fill with water. The girl, in an act of desperation, asked Harvey if the boat was sinking. The captain, without a word, simply jumped into the sea in a small life raft and drifted away, abandoning the 11-year-old girl aboard a ship that was going down. But seconds before the Bluebell disappeared beneath the Terry Joe managed to untie a small cork float and plunged into the sea. Without food, without a single drop of water, and wearing only a thin blouse and corduroy pants, she was left alone in the vastness of the Providence Channel. For 4 days and nights, the child fought against a sun that scorched her skin and against hallucinations that made her dream of islands and palm trees. She had to remain sitting and awake on the tiny float to avoid falling into the water, while sharks began to surround her fragile raft. Subsequent investigations brought to light the captain's dark past, revealing that Julian Harvey was a man with severe financial problems and an alarming tendency for lucrative accidents. It was discovered that just 2 months after marrying Mary Dean, Harvey had taken out a life insurance policy worth $20,000 that paid double in the event of accidental death. Experts concluded that Harvey planned to murder his wife and simulate an accident to collect the money, but was likely caught in the act by Arthur Dupereau. To leave no witnesses, the captain decided to eliminate the entire family. Furthermore, it became known that Harvey had already survived a suspicious car accident where his second wife and mother died, and that 2 other ships under his command had sunk in strange circumstances that allowed him to collect large sums of money. Terry Jo Dupereau, known to the press as the Orphan of the Sea, managed to rebuild her life away from the public eye, changing her name to Terry to leave behind the stigma of being a victim. For decades, she kept silent about what occurred on the Bluebell, until in 2010 she decided to publish her autobiography to give hope to others who have gone through similar tragedies. Her terrible experience served at least to unmask a serial killer and also to modify maritime laws. Because her white float was nearly impossible to see at sea, international maritime regulations were changed starting in 1962, requiring all life-saving equipment to be a bright orange color. The UFO encounter of the USS Nimitz. On the morning of the 14th of November, 2004, Commander David Fravor was flying over the Pacific Ocean very close to the southern coast of California, conducting a U.S. Navy training exercise, when he received a rather strange instruction. He was told to abandon the exercise and head to a specific point over the sea. The communication came from the USS Princeton, a ship that was part of the USS Nimitz carrier strike group. They did not give him many details, only letting him know that there was a real contact in the zone and they needed someone to check it visually. Although this might have seemed strange to Fravor and the other pilots, for the Princeton operators, it was nothing new. For almost 2 weeks, their radars had been detecting objects that appeared at high altitude, descended rapidly toward the sea, and then remained there for hours, moving in a way that was very difficult to explain. Initially, some thought they could be system errors, sensor failures, or simple false readings, so they even checked and recalibrated the radars to rule out that possibility. However, the contacts kept appearing again and again until they finally decided to send planes to verify if there was really something out there. That morning, Fravor was not alone. In another A-18 Super Hornet flew Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, also accompanied by her weapons systems officer. So between the 2 planes, there were 4 people observing the same point in the ocean, hoping to find perhaps another plane, some type of drone, or anything that could explain what the USS Princeton had been recording for days. But when they reached the indicated area, they noticed that there was something, although it was not exactly in the sky. The day was clear, with good visibility, and below them, the ocean seemed relatively calm, except for one part of the water that looked completely different from the rest. It was a large, agitated area, with foam and swirls, as if something were stirring the surface from just below. Fravor would later describe it as a large disturbance, of a size similar to a commercial plane, although from his altitude, he couldn't distinguish what was causing it. And then, above this same part of the sea, they saw the object. It was white, smooth, and elongated, about 10 or 15 meters long, approximately the size of a fighter jet. It had no visible wings, windows, tail, or rotors. It also left no smoke, fire, or any kind of trail, and because of its shape, they would end up comparing it to a tic-tac, like a white capsule that was suspended just above the sea. For several minutes, the pilots watched as this object moved over the area of agitated water. They described that it didn't behave like a plane and didn't behave like a helicopter, as it changed direction with speed, moved in a strange manner, and, as they commented, it looked as if it were inspecting something below the surface. Fravor then decided to get closer to observe it better. He began to descend in a spiral toward the object, trying to keep it in sight, and then something even more unusual happened. The object seemed to react to his movement. It didn't move away immediately, but it didn't stay still either. Fravor would explain later that as he descended, this thing started to rise as if both were circling each other over the ocean. For a few seconds, the situation stopped feeling like a simple observation and became a sort of direct encounter. Fravor wasn't looking at a simple spot on a radar, a distant silhouette, or even a light on the horizon. He was tracking with his own eyes a white object that moved in a way that didn't correspond to anything he had ever seen before. And suddenly, this object vanished. It didn't accelerate like an airplane would. It didn't take momentum, didn't leave a mark, didn't produce a visible speed explosion, and didn't have a trail that allowed it to follow its trajectory. It simply shot off at such a high speed that the pilots lost sight of it instantly. Fravor and the others reported that they had lost visual contact, but the response they received from the USS Princeton made everything even more disconcerting for them. The commander said that the object had appeared on the radar again, only it was no longer near them. Now, it was about 60 miles away. If this reading was correct, it would mean that the object covered in less than a minute a distance that would have been very difficult to explain for any type of conventional aircraft. Later, another crew was sent to the same area, and on this occasion, pilot Chad Underwood managed to record an object similar to it with an infrared camera. It was that recording that, over the years, would end up being known as the Tic Tac video. In 2020, the U.S. Department of Defense officially acknowledged that this video was authentic. They didn't say it was an alien spacecraft, and they didn't confirm a fantastic explanation. They simply accepted that the material was real, that it had been recorded by Navy personnel, and that the phenomenon that appeared in it was still considered something unidentified. Over the years, David Fravor and Alex Dietrich have spoken publicly about what happened, and Fravor even appeared before the United States Congress during a hearing on unidentified anomalous phenomena. By then, the case already had a date, a location, several military witnesses, radar records, and an officially recognized recording. And yet, more than 20 years later, no one has been able to say with certainty what it was that these pilots had seen. Perhaps it was secret military technology. Perhaps there were interpretation errors, sensor failures, or data that we still do not know. But the unsettling part of this case is not really in ensuring that the object was an extraterrestrial that came from another world, but in thinking that several trained pilots, supported by advanced military systems, observed something over the sea that they could not identify, could not reach, and above all, have not been able to explain. The tragedy of the Batavia. The Batavia was a ship of approximately 56 meters in length, built in the shipyards of Amsterdam, belonging to the Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC. In October 1628, the Batavia was prepared to embark on its maiden voyage to the Dutch East Indies. The ship carried a valuable cargo consisting of chests filled with silver coins, gold ingots, merchandise, and other company goods. On the 29th of October 1628, the Batavia set sail from the island of Texel with 342 people on board. On the ship were sailors, soldiers, and company officials, but there were also common men, women, and children who hoped to start a new life on the other side of the world. The leader of the vessel was Francisco Pelsart. Although Francisco held the position of highest authority on the ship, navigation fell to Captain Ariane Jacobs, who felt a deep resentment toward Pelsart for being his subordinate. To this already tense situation was added the presence of someone else, a man named Geronimus Cornelis, a former apothecary from Haarlem who had left the Netherlands after becoming involved in financial problems and suspicions of heresy. Cornelis formed a close relationship with Jacobs, and as the days passed, both began to share their discontent regarding Pelsart's authority. While the officers and more well-to-do passengers could enjoy certain privileges, the sailors and soldiers were relegated to unsanitary spaces, surrounded by rats, parasites, and spoiled provisions. In that atmosphere of tension, Captain Jacobs, with the help of Cornelis, began to plan a mutiny to seize the cargo of silver and gold. For weeks, they discreetly recruited several men, and to provoke the chaos necessary to take control of the ship, they organized an attack against Lucretia Jans. She was a passenger of high social standing with dazzling beauty, traveling to Java to reunite with her husband. Both Captain Jacobs and Commander Pelsart had tried to court her without success. After rejecting them, Lucretia remained under Pelsart's protection, which increased the captain's resentment. And as if that weren't enough, this girl also greatly attracted Cornelis. The plan of Jacobs and Cornelis was to perform an action so intolerable that it would force Pelsaert to impose severe punishments against the captain and his friend, which would earn them the sympathy of the crew for their rebellious cause. They took advantage of the fact that Pelsaert had been bedridden for more than a month with a debilitating fever. One night, a group of men intercepted Lucretia on the deck. They held her with violence, lifted her skirts, and in an act of total humiliation, covered her body and her clothing with a disgusting mixture of tar and excrement. Lucretia could not identify her attackers among the shadows of the night. Francisco Pelsaert, after conducting an exhaustive investigation, understood the gravity of the situation and the suspicions fell on the captain, but he decided to act with great caution. He avoided an open confrontation and decided to postpone any punishment until reaching the safety of firm land, momentarily thwarting the mutineers' plans to start a revolt. But following the Brouwer route, the ship advanced too far east without anyone noticing the proximity to the Australian coast. And during the early morning of the 4th of June 1629, the lookout observed white foam in the darkness and warned the captain. But Jacobs ignored the warning. Minutes later, the ship smashed violently against the reefs in the Houtman-Abrolhos Islands. The impact was devastating. Attempts to save the vessel were futile. Nearly 40 people died by drowning before reaching firm land. The survivors took refuge on small, arid islets where there was no fresh water or sufficient food. Conscious that everyone would die of thirst if something weren't done, Pelsaert departed in a small boat along with the captain and several navigators to seek help. Left behind on the islands were more than 180 castaways, among them Geronimus Cornelis. The absence of authority allowed the apothecary to take control. Taking advantage of the confusion, he convinced a good number of people to name him leader, and then convinced everyone that to guarantee order and manage the scarce supplies of food and water, it was essential to centralize every resource. Under this excuse, he ordered the immediate surrender of all weapons, boats, and tools. To ensure obedience and crush any resistance, he used the score of followers he had already secretly recruited for the mutiny during the voyage, who acted as a personal armed guard that stripped the rest of the castaways of any means of defense. Afterward, he sent 22 soldiers led by Wiebe Hayes to a distant island under the pretext that they should look for water, convinced that they were going to die there, leaving the rest of the castaways without protection. Soon, he decided that provisions would not reach everyone and began to commit selective executions under false accusations, a measure that soon turned into an authentic massacre. Cornelis rarely killed personally. He preferred to force his men to do it to turn them into accomplices. Men, women, and children were taken from their shelters during the night to have their throats cut, be stabbed, or be thrown into the sea to drown. Among the most heartbreaking anecdotes is the occasion when he tried to poison a baby, and upon verifying that it was still alive, he ordered it to be strangled. It is also told that a preacher was forced to watch as they murdered almost his entire family while he shared a table with Cornelis himself. The fate of the surviving women was to be turned into sex slaves. Lucretia Jans was reserved for the apothecary, while the others were distributed among his followers. The island had become a true hell. However, his reign of terror began to crumble when Wiebe Hayes' soldiers, whom he had sent to die, ironically discovered fresh water and abundant food on that island. Soon after, fugitives began to arrive, recounting the massacres occurring on the other island. Hayes then organized a defensive force using improvised weapons made from wreckage and also built a small stone fort. When Cornelis found out that the soldiers were still alive, he launched several attacks to destroy them, but failed again and again. Finally, in desperation, he tried to negotiate in person. Hayes took the opportunity, ambushed the apothecary, and took him as a prisoner after killing his companions. On the 17th of September, 1629, while a confrontation was occurring in which the remaining mutineers launched a last armed assault against Hayes's fort, the Sardam, a rescue ship sent by Pelsaert 3 months after having departed, appeared on the horizon. At that moment, a desperate race toward the vessel took place. Hayes managed to arrive first and warned Pelsaert about the rebellion and the massacres. When the mutineers tried to board the ship, they were met by the cannons of the Sardam and surrendered. Of the more than 300 people who had departed on the Batavia, barely more than 100 remained. Cornelis and his main collaborators were interrogated, tortured, and sentenced to death. The apothecary had both hands amputated before being taken to the gallows. Other mutineers were executed on the same islands, while some were abandoned on the Australian coast to die there. The The remaining ones were sent to Batavia to receive equally brutal punishments. Pelsaert died shortly after the rescue. Jacobs ended up forgotten in a prison in Java, and Wiebe Hayes was recognized as a hero. As for Lucretia, upon arriving in the city of Batavia, she discovered that she had become a widow, since her husband, whom she planned to reunite with, had passed away. Sometime later, she remarried a military officer. It is known that she returned to Europe and died in Amsterdam in 1681. Centuries later, when the remains of the Batavia were discovered under the sea, archaeologists found coins, jewelry, and skeletons with clear signs of extreme violence, confirming that the stories about the nightmare that had been lived in that place were completely real. The mystery of the MV Joyita. The morning of the 10th of November, 1955, Captain Gerald Douglas of the merchant ship Tuvalu was navigating near Fiji when he saw something strange in the distance. It was a vessel, but it didn't move like a normal ship. It seemed to be drifting, abandoned to the mercy of the ocean. As he got closer, the scene started to become quite disturbing. The ship was heavily listed to port, with part of the railing going in and out of the water. The windows were broken, the upper structure had visible damage, and on the deckhouse was an improvised tarp, as if someone had tried to protect themselves from the sun for several days in the middle of the sea. The name could still be read on the hull. It was the MV Joyita. When the crew of the Tuvalu climbed aboard, they found a scene very difficult to explain. There was no one, not the captain, not the crew, and not the passengers. The 25 people who should have been there had disappeared, and along with them, the dinghy and the ship's 3 life rafts were also missing. Everything seemed to indicate that those on board had abandoned the Joyita, but that only made the finding stranger, because although the ship was damaged, listed, and partially flooded, it was still floating. To understand how it arrived there, one must go back several weeks, to the early morning of the 3rd of October 1955, when the Joyita left the port of Apia in Samoa bound for the Tokelau Islands. It was a 270-mile trip that in theory should have lasted less than 2 days. On board went 16 crew members and 9 passengers, plus some 4 tons of cargo consisting of food, wood, medical supplies, and dozens of empty barrels. This trip didn't seem especially dangerous to many people in the area. Moving between islands was part of daily life, and although the route crossed an enormous expanse of the South Pacific, the Joyita was not an improvised vessel. It had been built in 1931 as a luxury yacht in Los Angeles. Afterward, it was used by the United States Navy during the Second World War, and over the years, it ended up being converted into a merchant ship to transport cargo and passengers between the islands. However, even before setting sail, there were already some problems. The MV Joyita was supposed to leave the day before, but its departure was delayed because the clutch of the port engine had failed. The repair could not be completed in time, and even so, Captain Thomas Dusty Miller decided to start the trip with only one engine working. The ship had to arrive in Tokelau on October 5, but that day passed without signs of it. The next day, the destination port reported that the Joyita was missing, and since no distress call had been received, the authorities initiated a search. For several days, Royal New Zealand Air Force planes covered an enormous area of the ocean attempting to find the vessel or any trace of its occupants, but nothing appeared. There were no remains, no rafts, no bodies, but also no signs of life. For 5 weeks, the Joyita seemed to have vanished completely until it appeared near Fiji, hundreds of miles from the route it should have followed. And once the authorities were able to review the ship in more detail, the mystery became even more confusing. The radio was tuned to the international emergency frequency, which suggested that someone had tried to ask for help, but upon checking the equipment, they discovered that the antenna cable was broken and had been painted over, so the real range of the radio would have been only a few kilometers. That is, perhaps they did call for help, but practically no one was listening. There were also other details that were considered strange. For example, the ship's electric clocks had stopped at 10:25, likely when the generator ceased functioning during the night. The logbook, the sextant, some important instruments, and the weapons that the captain kept on board were also missing. On deck, a medical bag appeared with instruments, a stethoscope, a scalpel, and blood-stained bandages, although it was never clearly established who had been wounded or what had happened. In the engine room, authorities found signs that the crew had tried to deal with an internal flood. A corroded pipe from the cooling system had broken, allowing water to enter little by little into the lower part of the ship. The pumps were clogged and couldn't get the water out correctly, plus someone had tried to install an auxiliary pump, but it wasn't connected. The engine that was still working appeared covered with mattresses, possibly to protect it from the splashing water while the ship was listing more and more. All this explained why the Joyita had ended up damaged, listed, and without energy. But that still didn't explain the most important question: why did everyone abandon it? The Joyita was not a common ship. Its hull was lined with cork to help preserve refrigerated cargo, and it also carried empty barrels that increased its buoyancy even further. In fact, according to various experts, even flooded and in bad condition, it was extremely difficult for it to sink completely. Indeed, when it was towed to port and they pumped all the water out, it floated steadily again. The formal investigation concluded that the ship was in very poor condition and that Captain Miller had been negligent in setting sail with mechanical failures, a defective radio, and insufficient equipment. But still, the fate of the 25 people was considered inexplicable with the available evidence. But as always happens in these cases, over time several theories began to arise. There was talk of the possibility that the captain had been wounded or rendered unconscious, causing the others to panic and decide to abandon the ship. It was also suggested there could have been a possible mutiny, a fight between Miller and his first officer, Chuck Simpson, or the idea that the passengers thought they saw land and threw themselves into the sea in the rafts trying to reach a nearby island. Afterward, rumors appeared about pirates, Japanese ships, Soviet submarines, and even fraud. But none of these hypotheses managed to explain completely what had happened. Decades later, the mystery is still not solved. The 25 people on board have not been found, and the Joyita, which was once a luxury yacht, ended up running aground several more times until it was left abandoned and disappeared little by little on a beach in Fiji. The shark attack on the USS Indianapolis. Without a doubt, something these tales have in common, besides having occurred at sea, is the constant sensation of being part of a fictional story. They are so raw and strange that they seem to have come out of the twisted mind of a disturbed writer. And yet, they are completely real. What I will tell you next is no exception. At the end of July 1945, the USS Indianapolis navigated under a mantle of absolute secrecy. This United States Navy cruiser had just completed one of the most critical missions of the Second World War. It had just transported in record time the components of the first operational atomic bomb to the island of Tinian. After delivering its load of enriched uranium, the vessel departed from Guam toward the Gulf of Leyte in the Philippines to join the preparations for the invasion of Japan. However, the ship was traveling completely alone, without an escort and without sonar to detect threats beneath the surface. Although the area was active with enemy presence, naval intelligence did not warn Captain Charles B. McVeigh III about the dangers lurking on his route. It was thus that shortly after midnight on July 30, a Japanese submarine lurking in the darkness fired 2 torpedoes that struck full on the side of the ship. The first explosion ripped off the starboard bow and ignited thousands of gallons of fuel, creating a terrifying column of fire. The second impact hit the center of the vessel, causing a chain reaction in the ammunition depots that practically split the cruiser in two. While the fires consumed everything below deck, the vessel, which was still moving at high speed, began to fill with water massively. In just 12 minutes, the vessel, the size of a football field, disappeared beneath the waves. Of the nearly 1,200 men who made up the crew, approximately 900 managed to jump into the water in the middle of the darkness, many of them wounded, covered in oil, and without a life raft. At dawn on the first day, the survivors found themselves scattered in groups across the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, trusting that a rescue would arrive soon. They were unaware that Naval Command had ignored their distress signals and that no one had reported the ship's disappearance when it didn't arrive at its destination. But the worst was not that. It was that, attracted by the roar of the explosions, the constant movement, and the blood in the water, hundreds of sharks began to circle the castaways. These were mainly oceanic white-tip sharks and tiger sharks, which are known for their aggression and their ability to detect prey from a great distance. The sharks began their hunting ritual with chilling precision. At first, they focused on the bodies of those who had died during the sinking or from the initial wounds. The sailors, realizing this and in a desperate attempt to survive, formed compact groups, believing that unity could provide them some defense. However, the sharks began to circle the groups in ever-tightening circles. Terror took hold of the men as they saw the fins cutting the water's surface. Every time someone separated from the group or remained alone on the fringes, the attack was imminent. Like a lightning bolt, the shark swam upward, snatched its prey, and dragged it into the depths, leaving behind only a red stain in the sea that did nothing but attract more predators. As the hours passed, the sun became an enemy as implacable as the sharks themselves. Without fresh water or food, the sailors suffered from severe heat that caused grave burns and painful blisters on their skin. Many, desperate for thirst, made the fatal mistake of drinking salt water, which accelerated their dehydration and provoked delusions and madness. Hallucinations began to spread among the groups. Some men believed they saw secret islands on the horizon or freshwater springs on the ocean floor, which caused them to dive and never return. In their agony, the most affected sailors became a threat to their own companions, eventually dragging them down in their final moments of life. In the midst of that nightmare, Chaplain Thomas Conway tried to keep morale high, swimming between the groups and talking to them to comfort them at least until he himself fell victim to a huge shark. The shark attacks did not cease and became more selective and terrifying. On one occasion, the scent of a can of meat, opened by a group of sailors, attracted so many sharks that the men had to throw the food into the sea to avoid a massacre. The atmosphere was simply terrifying. They were swimming in a sea of blood, waiting to know who would be the next to let out a horrifying scream before being dragged down. The sailors tried to defend themselves by screaming and kicking, but the sharks, especially the white tips, returned again and again with fierce aggression. The rescue arrived in the most unexpected way on August 2, when they had already been in that hell for 4 days. Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn, aboard a bomber on a routine patrol, detected by accident an oil slick on the water's surface. Upon descending to investigate, he was horrified to discover hundreds of men floating in the sea. Shortly after, a seaplane commanded by Lieutenant Adrian Marks arrived in the area, and upon seeing the sailors being attacked by sharks at that very instant, he decided to disobey orders not to land in the open sea. Marks landed his craft on the waves and began to pick up the castaways who were most isolated and in greatest danger. When the interior of the plane was completely full, the pilot used ropes to tie more survivors to the plane's wings, keeping them out of the water. That night, the vessel USS Doyle finally arrived at the location and turned on its powerful searchlights, a light that many sailors mistook for the arrival of angels in the midst of the darkness. Of the nearly 1,200 men who began the trip, only 317 survived to tell their story. However, the end of the rescue did not mean the end of the suffering for Captain Charles McVay III. In an attempt to find someone to blame, the Navy subjected him to a court-martial, accusing him of endangering the ship by not navigating in a zigzag pattern. Even the commander of the Japanese submarine that had sunk him testified that such a maneuver would have changed the outcome. But McVay was convicted anyway. Crushed by guilt and the constant harassment of hate mail from the relatives of the deceased, the captain took his own life years later. It was not until decades later that his name was exonerated and officially cleared. In 2017, the remains of the USS Indianapolis were found at more than 5,000 meters deep, being the only thing left of that terrifying anecdote where so many people suffered a living hell. The shipwreck of the Princess Augusta. For generations, the inhabitants of Block Island, a small island off the coast of Rhode Island, spoke of a strange light that appeared over the sea during winter nights. Some described it as a distant flare, others as a kind of torch floating in the darkness. And there were also those who claimed that at times the light seemed to take the form of an entire ship wrapped in flames. And according to the legend, this was no common vessel. For many inhabitants of the area, this apparition was known as the Palatine Light, the supposed ghost of a ship that had been lost in the 17th century, condemned to return again and again to the place where a maritime tragedy had remained marked forever. And although with the passage of time the history has been filled with rumors, dark versions, and supernatural elements, the truth is that all this began as a real shipwreck. The ship was called the Princess Augusta, although years later it would be remembered simply as the Palatine, due to the fact that many of its passengers came from the Palatinate region in what today would be southwestern Germany. These were immigrants who had left Rotterdam in August 1738 with the hope of reaching the English colonies in America, probably Philadelphia, to start a new life there far from Europe. But this trip turned into a true nightmare long before touching land. On board traveled hundreds of people between passengers and crew, but during the voyage, the water was contaminated. Thus, diseases began. Conditions worsened very quickly. Food began to run out. Storms battered the vessel for weeks, and the ship was finally pushed off course, which caused many people to die before even being able to see the American coast. Among the deceased was the captain himself, George Long, so the command ended up in the hands of the first officer named Andrew Brooke. According to some statements taken after the shipwreck, the situation on board became increasingly cruel. Brooke supposedly forced the passengers to pay for the remaining rations, even when many were already sick, starving, and practically without resources. By the time the Princess Augusta arrived near Block Island, a good part of those who had begun that journey had already died, and the survivors were weakened, frozen, and desperate. Finally, on the 27th of December, 1738, in the middle of a snowstorm, the ship ran aground near Sandy Point, on the northern end of Block Island. What happened next depends really on the version told, because according to some historical accounts, the crew managed to reach land first, initially leaving the passengers on board until the island's inhabitants intervened and helped the survivors down. It is also said that the islanders buried several of the people who died after the shipwreck and that many of the survivors ended up reaching the mainland to continue their journey. But with the passage of time, much darker versions began to circulate. In some, the islanders were not rescuers, but looters who had attracted the ship with false lights to make it run aground and steal everything it carried on board. In others, the crew itself had been the ones who mistreated the passengers, withholding food and abandoning the vessel when it no longer had salvation. The story of a woman also emerged, sometimes called Mary Vannerline, who had been trapped on the ship either because she was forgotten, because she refused to get off, or because she had lost her mind after so much suffering. According to this version, when the Princess Augusta was set on fire and pushed back into the sea, the woman was still on board and her screams could be heard from the coast while the vessel burned in the darkness. The truth is that it is not very clear what really happened. In fact, some subsequent investigations suggest that several of the most terrible parts of this legend could have been exaggerations, rumors, or deformations of popular memory. There is even evidence that the ship perhaps was not abandoned in the way that is told in tradition, that it was not attracted with false lights, and that perhaps it wasn't even destroyed by fire. But legends do not always need a complete truth to be able to survive. Shortly after the shipwreck, reports began of sightings of a strange light at sea, near the point where the Princess Augusta had run aground. Some claimed to see it between Christmas and New Year's as if it appeared near the anniversary of the tragedy. Others claimed that it was not a simple light, but, as I said before, a ghost ship that was wrapped in flames. In 1811, an inhabitant of the island named Dr. Wiley described the apparition as a fire seen several miles from the coast, sometimes small like the light of a distant window, and other times as large as a ship moving over the water like a torch. Over the years, this story was repeated by sailors, inhabitants of the island, visitors, and writers. The poet John Greenleaf Whittier even helped immortalize it in the 19th century with his poem The Palatine, and since then, the Palatine Light remained converted into one of the best-known maritime legends of New England. To this day, no definitive remains of the Princess Augusta have been found, nor evidence that confirms the darkest versions of this tale. What does exist is the memory of a ship full of immigrants who crossed the Atlantic in terrible conditions, arrived in America almost in pieces, and ended up run aground on an island that was covered by snow. The Mignonette Case. This chilling story begins in May 1884, when a small pleasure yacht called the Mignonette set sail from Southampton in England, bound for Sydney, Australia. The vessel, barely 16 meters long, was not designed for such a long and dangerous journey through the open ocean, but an Australian lawyer had bought it and hired an experienced crew to deliver it. In command was Captain Tom Dudley, a respected man accompanied by Edwin Stevens, Edmund Brooks, and traveling with them was Richard Parker, a 17-year-old cabin boy. He was an orphan with little experience at sea and saw in this trip his first great adventure. During the first weeks, the trip passed without major incidents. But on July 5, while navigating about 2,600 kilometers from the Cape of Good Hope, the weather changed drastically. A giant wave hit the yacht with such force that it destroyed part of the structure. Captain Dudley understood immediately that the Mignonette would sink in minutes. The four men barely had time to launch a fragile wooden lifeboat, only 4 meters long, into the water. In the desperation to abandon the ship, they only managed to rescue a few navigation instruments, 2 tins of turnips, and no water. The shipwreck left the 4 men adrift in the middle of the South Atlantic, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest land. They had to use the oars to defend themselves from a shark that was bumping the boat from below. And on July 7, they shared the first tin of turnips, dividing it into 5 pieces to last 2 days. Shortly after, they managed to capture a small sea turtle that gave them a momentary respite with its meat and bones. But the lack of water became an unbearable torture shortly after. With no rain to collect, by July 13, desperation led them to drink their own urine. As the days passed, young Richard Parker began to weaken faster than the others. In an act of desperation, the boy had drunk seawater, which caused him a very serious illness and left him in a state of semi-consciousness. By July 20, Parker could no longer move, and it was then that an ancient and macabre maritime tradition known as the custom of the sea began to haunt the minds of his companions. This unwritten rule suggested that in cases of extreme survival, one should leave it to fate to decide who should die so that the others could feed on him. Captain Dudley suggested drawing lots, but Brooks refused flatly. However, Dudley and Stevens observed that young Parker was falling into a coma and reasoned that as he was the weakest and had no wife or children, his death was inevitable and could be useful. On July 24, after almost 3 weeks without real food, Dudley and Stevens exchanged a silent signal. After praying a brief prayer, Captain Dudley approached the youth and with a pocket knife cut his jugular vein. Brooks, although he did not participate in the plan and did not agree at the beginning, joined the other 2 to feed on the boy's body. Over the following days, the 3 men consumed the blood, heart, and liver of the cabin boy to keep themselves alive, an act of cannibalism that Dudley would later describe as a nightmare where they acted like demented wolves. Finally, on July 29, a German ship called the Montezuma spotted the small boat and rescued the 3 survivors, who, convinced that their action was justified by extreme necessity, told the truth of what happened as soon as they touched land in England. Upon disembarking in Falmouth on the 6th of September 1884, Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks gave detailed and honest statements to customs authorities, convinced that the custom of the sea and extreme necessity justified their acts. The victim's own brother, Daniel Parker, showed compassion toward the castaways. But the Home Office, led by Sir William Harcourt, decided that the case should be prosecuted to end once and for all the tradition of survival cannibalism. To ensure a conviction, the prosecution decided not to file charges against Edmund Brooks, turning him into the main witness against his companions. The trial in the city of Exeter became a legal battlefield because Judge Huddleston realized something very important. The townspeople felt so much pity for the sailors that a normal jury would probably set them free out of sheer compassion. To prevent the accused from escaping what he considered just, the judge used a legal rule that was almost never used in that era called a special verdict. With this method, the jury had no obligation to decide if the men were guilty or innocent. Their only task was to confirm that the narrated facts were true. Thus, the jury simply took for granted that young Richard Parker was very weak, that he would surely die before the others, and that if they didn't kill him to feed, it was almost certain that the 4 crew members would have died at sea. Upon accepting these facts, the final decision on whether the act was legally considered murder was transferred to a group of 5 expert judges in the City of London. It was in December 1884 when the head of those judges, Lord Coleridge, handed down a sentence that would change laws forever. The court rejected with great firmness the idea that the need to survive is a valid excuse for one person to take the life of another. The judge explained that although conserving one's own life is a natural desire, sometimes the highest duty of a human being is to be willing to sacrifice oneself instead of committing a crime, just as soldiers do in wars or heroes who die trying to save others. Finally, Dudley and Stevens were sentenced to the death penalty. But because a large part of society felt the punishment was too harsh, the government decided to commute the original sentence to only 6 months in prison. A disturbing detail about this case is that 46 years before the shipwreck, in 1838, the famous writer Edgar Allan Poe published his only novel titled The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, where he told the story of 4 castaways trapped in a boat who decide that one must die to feed the others. But that is not the only thing, as the name of the character who was sacrificed in the novel and devoured by his companions was Richard Parker.